the data shows that there is an unprecedented rise in both stress and burnout. So data shows that anywhere from 50 to 70% of people are experiencing some version of
Wow.
stress or burnout. That's like saying in a room of 30 people, 21 people are struggling with stress or burnout.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are wondering, could I be stressed? Could this symptom, my doctor said everything was fine. Could this be related to stress? Again, stress doesn't cause the symptoms, it can make it worse, right?
Mm-hmm.
So most likely you are the rule rather than the exception, because all of us in some capacity, now more than ever, are experiencing stress. And so managing your stress in the now, using some of the techniques that we're going to talk about today, that's in the 5 resets, etc., can actually help lots of things because it's all connected. It will help your sleep. And there's
Mm-hmm.
various things that we can talk about. It will help your whatever symptom you have. Ultimately, because stress makes things worse, though it might not cause the actual
Mm-hmm.
symptom.
Welcome to the Better Brain Podcast, where we talk about everything brain health for anyone who has a brain or knows somebody who does and wants to make it better.
Our guest today is Dr. Aditi Neurukar. She's a Harvard-trained physician specializing in stress, resiliency, and mental health. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, as well as Time Magazine. She's here today to talk about her new book, The 5 Resets, Rewire Your Brain and Body for Less Stress and More Resiliency. It provides practical strategies on how to improve your stress levels and create more resiliency.
So we got into it today with her talking deep about the brain, but also about much more accessible and actionable items that you could use in everyday life to rewire the brain. I think perhaps most interesting, though, to me was some of the key terms that I had never heard that we face today as unique stressors: popcorn brain, things like doom scrolling, and procrastinating late at night right before you get to bed with things that probably affect sleep. You need to tune in, listen to the whole thing, because she reveals not only these kind of less talked about areas of stress, but also some secrets about her own life and what inspired her to write this book.
My favorite part was at the end of our recording where we get to the 5 resets to be able to build resiliency and improve your stress levels. Make sure you tune in.
Our audience is going to be so excited that you're here with us. Everything you're going to talk about, that some of which they may know on stress and resilience, and tons they won't know, are definitely going to be helpful for them. But I'm also personally very interested because back in my PhD days, I started to study stress and resilience from Dr. Dennis Charney. His perspective on veterans from the Vietnam War and what protected some against PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. He listed off 5 or 6 things that were beliefs or mindsets, like the belief in a higher power, the belief in one's control over life circumstances, or the belief in one's ability to overcome challenge, or that obstacles were just opportunities to grow from. And I tried to translate that into the MRI and understand how the brain makes and manages stress. So personally, I'm very interested. I'm interested in the circuits I looked at, connecting the frontal lobe to the amygdala, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. But before we dig even deeper into the brain and your book, I'd like to give you the opportunity, as we always do on the Better Brain podcast, to tell your origin story and specifically tell us what inspired you to write the book.
So thank you for starting there. I love talking about my villain origin story. And it's an absolute pleasure to join you both, because it's not every day that I get to talk to fellow clinicians and folks who are in the medical field who are doing this work as well. So it's really such a pleasure to be with you. And we've already talked offline about my real deep love for sunny Los Angeles after living on the East Coast for far too long. My origin story begins, I'm now a physician with an expertise on stress, but it started because I was a stress patient looking for answers. I was a second-year internal medicine resident, as you both have been in the past. I was rotating in the cardiac ICU, taking care of everyone else's hearts and not really thinking about my own. I was working about 80 hours a week, seeing death and dying on a daily basis, as we do in our medical training.
Yeah.
And back then, when I was in my medical training, at least, words like self-care or burnout or stress, boundaries, these were not part of our lexicon. What I was taught, and likely you as well, early in my medical training, I was in a room, a large auditorium with all of my peers. It might have been the first month or the second month of medical training. And the professor gets up and says, pressure makes diamonds, and you are all diamonds in the making. And this road to becoming a doctor is filled with pressure, and you're going to rise above because pressure makes diamonds. And so that was my mantra going through my medical training. When things got tough, I was like, pressure makes diamonds. Just keep going, Aditi. Put your head down and keep working and keep going and toiling. And then my diamond cracked. And my diamond cracked as a second year medical resident in the cardiac ICU. I just finished a pretty brutal 30-hour call and was finishing up rounding on my patients before I left and went home. And I felt a flutter across my chest. It felt like a stampede of wild horses. Quite terrifying, knocked the wind out of me, quite literally. I sat down, and the nurse, who was my friend, and we'd worked together for a long time, noticed right away, brought me some orange juice, and we both laughed it off. Like, it's probably just post-call, and I haven't eaten enough, and I haven't slept, and you'll be fine. So I drank my orange juice. The feeling passed. I got up and kept rounding on my patients, just like every good trainee does. And then I went home, and it never happened again in the hospital. But that feeling, the stampede of wild horses, followed me night after night at home, right as I would go to sleep. I now understand what was happening to me. It was the delayed stress reaction, which we can talk about. But at the time, it was just very terrifying. I hadn't even connected thinking that, hey, could this be stress? I thought it was my heart. And I actually thought I had medical student syndrome, which you and I both know is like when you're rounding, right? Like I was in the cardiac ICU. So I was thinking about hearts a lot. And so, of course, I was going to be more aware of mine. And so that stampede of wild horses, I'm like, oh, it's probably nothing. But after week 2 and 3, and it wouldn't really get better at night, is when I went to go see a doctor.
Yeah.
As a doctor, I went to go see my doctor. She did the full workup, checked my electrolytes, checked my thyroid, checked for anemia, did an EKG, did an electrocardiogram, did a echo, a heart ultrasound, and everything checked out normal. So she was like, congratulations, Aditi. It's all good. Big reassuring smile. It's just stress. Try and relax. We've all been there. Medical training is tough. And so I left. And I was like, okay, just stress, try to relax. So what do I do? So I just did what I thought would help, which is I was single at the time. I went to movies with friends. I got a massage, retail therapy, took a vacation, had wonderful dinners out with my family, and nothing really seemed to help. I kept having that stampede of wild horses. And only when I put my scientist hat on, really dug into the science of stress and burnout, what happens to your brain and your body, is when I found my way out. And then when I found my way out of stress and started using some of those techniques for myself, is when I was like very clear and made the vow to become the doctor I needed during that difficult time.
Wow.
Yeah, that's incredible. So let's get into stress. Stress has been stated to be a contributing factor to the 6 leading causes of death in the United States. So at face value, that probably makes a lot of people think that, we need to avoid stress at all costs. But let's start with a different perspective, maybe on the positive side of stress. Can you tell us what stress is and why humans experience it?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. So now stress is often found to be correlated with rather than causing lots of medical symptoms. And in one study, which is shocking, found that 60 to 80% of all primary care visits have a stress-related component. That's not to say that stress causes these symptoms, but certainly worsens symptoms like I had. I had palpitations and I went to go see a doctor. It wasn't actually my heart, it was stress. In the same way, 60 to 80% of all doctors' visits have this same sort of presentation, all sorts of symptoms. And yet, my research has found that only 3% of doctors counsel for stress. And so my work really aims to close that gap. But when you're thinking about stress, when you and I talk about stress, or like, oh, I've had a stressful day or a week, or in many people's cases, including ours, it's like, I've had a stressful 4 years, right? But stress, it's not all equal. And in fact, there are 2 kinds of stress. There is healthy stress and unhealthy stress. Good, healthy stress in scientific terms is called adaptive stress. It moves your life forward. Whereas unhealthy stress, the kind that you and I talk about, where we're like, oh, I'm so stressed, that's actually unhealthy stress. It's dysfunctional, unproductive, gets in the way of your everyday life. It's called maladaptive stress scientifically. And those two affect your brain and body very differently. Examples of positive, healthy, good stress: rooting for your favorite sports team, falling in love, getting a promotion or a new job, planning a vacation, us three getting together on this call, which, by the way, has taken quite a lot of juggling with our schedules and a major technical snafu on my end last month. And so all of these are examples of healthy, positive stress. However, unhealthy stress, we all know lots of examples of that, is what causes the mental and physical health manifestations. Now, that's not to say that the goal of life is not to live a life with zero stress. It's actually biologically impossible to do that because, as we know, physiologically, so in the body, that cortisol hormone, which is your stress hormone, spikes. It goes way up in the early morning hours, and it's quite literally what gets you out of bed in the morning. A little bit of healthy stress. But when that healthy stress goes haywire, off the rails, when it becomes a runaway train and becomes unhealthy stress, that's what we're talking about. And that's when you have to really pay attention. So the goal of life is not zero stress. It's a life with healthy, manageable stress that serves you rather than harms you. And a lot of my work focuses on transforming your relationship with stress away from dysfunctional back to productive that really can move your life forward.
Yeah, it was interesting. You stated that these different kinds of stresses actually affect the brain differently. Are you able to describe how these different stresses affect the brain a little bit differently?
I mean, more so, I don't think there have been, to my knowledge, any particular studies looking at like fMRI, for example, to see what parts of the brain light up with different sorts of these kinds of healthy or unhealthy stress. But what I'm simply stating is that stress is on a spectrum. And when it's on the healthy, positive side, it moves your life forward. It's motivating. And most likely, you're being led by the prefrontal cortex, right? Which is the area right behind your forehead that governs things like memory, planning, organization, complex problem solving. These are all positive things, what we in science and medicine call general executive functions. When you are at the top of your game, you have a little bit of healthy stress, your life is moving in a positive direction. That's all the prefrontal cortex that's really making things happen. But when you are in the unhealthy stress range, you are being led by another part of your brain called the amygdala. And that is deep within your brain. It's an almond-shaped structure, and its focus that's where your stress response lives. It's fight or flight. And that focus of your amygdala is cave person mode. And its focus is immediate survival, your needs, and self-preservation. And you can function for short periods of time in amygdala mode because your brain and body are expertly designed to handle short bursts of acute stress. But what we are facing now is ongoing chronic stress. It doesn't seem to really have an end. And that fight or flight response from your amygdala is very much about, fighting that tiger in the forest. You either fight the tiger or you run away. This is evolutionarily speaking. But now all of these tigers are metaphorical. We're not meeting tigers in the forest anymore. We're talking about financial constraints, relationship constraints, climate crises, and humanitarian crises all over the world. And our amygdala doesn't recognize the difference between what's happening in our backyard and what's happening thousands of miles away. And so that difference in how your brain registers healthy, positive stress and unhealthy stress is really about these two regions, your prefrontal cortex and amygdala. And the goal in the work that I do and the work that you do and in this conversation is to move away from amygdala mode back to the prefrontal cortex, out of survival mode, back to thriving.
Yeah. I love the way that you talk about changing your relationship with stress. And I like that we started with the better side of stress because really, as you mentioned, the purpose for humans is to have stress that we adapt to. And in so doing, we develop certain skills, strengths. And I look at that in a similar way to pain. Pain is not an experience human beings have that is all bad. In fact, if we didn't have pain, just as if we didn't have stress, we wouldn't survive. And that's well known. But I think about the amygdala in somewhat the same way that it's not all bad. The amygdala, in fact, I would expand the two F's to four F's. It's for fight, flight, feed, and fostering relationships, right? And so, if you get what I'm saying, it's also an approach, part of the brain that looks for reward, looks for positive things. But the point is that both pain and stress and ways of fueling the body's effort come from these regions that then need to be turned on quickly to handle a demand and turned off quickly. So that's where I always go with the warriors that we see who have chronic pain. And that's where I want to take the conversation, is to understand, how does stress go from something that's good, motivating, that fuels these positive behaviors and potentially leaves one stronger on the other side, to something that's smoldering, that's is a silent killer that we all talk about, that harms our lives, interferes with our ability to function.
That's a beautiful question. I think we can talk about so many factors that make healthy stress become unhealthy stress. And I think one of the key, so of course it's individual factors, but also broader societal factors, right? That really play a role in how we perceive stress and where our threshold is. And there's two main ideas that I want to kind of talk about when you're asking that question. The first is the canary in the coal mine. It's something that I've thought about very much. What I've experienced with many of my patients, and I personally experienced with that stampede of wild horses and continue to experience in different ways. I'm not a historian and I'm not much of a history buff, but I do know that in history, there's this analogy of canary in the coal mine. And that comes from when the coal miners would go down into the mines and they would toil and work for 16, 18 hours a day. And because humans are typically really bad at knowing what our limits are, they would take a caged bird, a canary, with them into the mines. And the canary would sing. And the minute the canary stopped singing, that's when the coal miners realized, wait a second, the air is bad. It's time to get out of the mines. And because they didn't know for themselves, like when the air got bad. And so they would come out of the mines. And that canary in the coal mine was their first sign of something gone awry. In many ways, we all have that canary inside of us that tells us, wait a second, this stress is moving from healthy to unhealthy. Some of us heed its warning early, so the canary might be like a whisper. But me and others didn't. So when I experienced that stampede of wild horses, chances are my body was telling me in different ways, hey, I think you're not sleeping enough. I don't think you're taking care of yourself. You're not resting as much as you should or decompressing in the right ways. And I probably didn't pay attention. And so I just kept going and going like many people do, thinking, oh, this is how life is supposed to be. And so you have to pay attention first to know what your canary is. And we can talk a little bit about that because everyone's canary is different. It can be headaches or chest pain, palpitations, abdominal pain, nausea, dizziness, fatigue, irritability. Now my canary is, because I've become a doctor with an expertise in stress, it's no longer that stampede of wild horses because that was a late stage canary. Now I typically, my husband will often say to me, I think you got to put the 5 resets back into play when I start getting irritable or a little bit snippy with him or my kids, like when I'm just a little bit, not as patient. And I know, okay, it's time. That canary is really singing its tune. And so the canary in the coal mine, you can think about, what is your canary? What is that stress symptom that seems to flare up anytime that stress is moving in the wrong direction? And then the second kind of idea that goes along with the canary in the coal mine is this idea of toxic resilience and the resilience myth. So when I was a medical resident and I was told by my doctor, it's just stress, try to relax, my first reaction was actually, what? Stress? Stress doesn't happen to people like me. I'm resilient because that's what I was taught. Yeah, I can handle it. I've been able to handle everything. When in fact, I was living the resilience myth, which is that resilient people don't get burned out and they certainly don't feel stressed. And we know categorically based on the science that is false. In fact, a study in the Journal of the American Medical Association found that resilience, while it's protective, it's not enough to prevent burnout and unhealthy stress. And so when you're talking about resilience and this idea of the resilience myth, we also have to talk about toxic resilience. And when you move from healthy stress to unhealthy stress, how does that happen? Another, besides the individual factors of canary in the coal mine, there is this broader global factor of toxic resilience. And what is that? It simply means that, true resilience, scientifically, what's the definition of resilience? It's your innate biological ability, we all have it, to adapt, recover, and grow in the face of life's challenges. Now, resilience doesn't work in a vacuum. You need a little bit of healthy stress for resilience to show itself. But toxic resilience is really what we're talking about here. And it's what most of us have been trained, at least in medical training, or often from childhood, to believe is true resilience. And toxic resilience is like using that word resilience, and it's been morphed, and it's dark and sinister. So it's a mind over matter mindset. It's productivity at all costs. It doesn't understand your human limitations of rest and recovery. And that is what, you've been taught from a very young age. Tolerating large amounts of discomfort is what resilience is all about.
No pain, no gain, right?
No pain, no gain. And, Energizer Bunny, just keep going. Or in the UK, keep calm and carry on. Yeah. And so if that's what you've been taught, like we all have been taught, particularly in the medical community, very much so, then it is very easy to see how healthy, productive stress could easily go off the rails and become unhealthy stress.
Yeah. You mentioned the canary in the coal mine and the kind of symptoms that some people experience sometimes. And they're relatively, I think, non-specific, right? And it seems like they're unique to individuals. But because of the nature of them being non-specific, it doesn't necessarily always come back to stress, right? Like,
oh, I love that. Thank you for saying that, because I always say that as a caveat, because as a doctor, I have to say that if you're having headaches or abdominal pain or chest pain, it's not stress. Stress is a diagnosis of exclusion, meaning I went to my doctor because I was like, I think it's my heart. Right. And she did the full workup and said, no, it's actually everything checks out fine. And it's most likely stress. So you have to see a doctor. If you're having symptoms and you're like, wait a second, could this be stress? See your doctor. I have to say that as a doctor. Go get the full medical workup. And then if your doctor says, oh, everything checks out fine, it's most likely stress, then you go down this path that we're talking about.
Yeah. But what about without necessarily seeing a doctor who states this is most likely stress? Because, in a lot of doctor-patient encounters, that conversation probably isn't even had, right? Like, it's just like, well, you don't have this, this, and this, so you're fine. Right?
Oh, yeah, that's right.
But so, bringing down this topic to people and making it really practical, how should people hit on, okay, well, is this stress, or is this a lack of sleep, or is this just I skipped a meal, so on and so forth? Like, is it just a matter of contextualizing your symptoms and looking at your environment? Has anything changed? Is my life more stressful, or is it something else other than that?
That's a great question. And I think first and foremost, if you're having a symptom, go see your doctor, get the medical workup. And then if you get a clean bill of health saying like, oh no, your heart's fine, or your stomach's fine, or, your bones and joints and et cetera, you're good. Everything's fine. Your initial workup came back normal, as we say, within normal limits. And then the doctor's like, peace out. You're good. See you later. See you in 6 months. That doctor, you're right. Most people aren't going to say, oh, it's most likely stress. And if they do say it's stress, it's not like doctors can actually advise and say, this is what you need to do. Because stress is often, this is not an individual failing of physicians. This is a systems failing, right? We know that doctors have to work 27 hours to do their job well. And if you're worried about checking cholesterol and cancer screenings and doing all of the various metrics that doctors have to do for various insurance companies, et cetera, then stress is often the last thing on the list, and it falls down way low. It's not to say, stress is very much the elephant in the exam room, but it's simply that it's like this vague, nebulous thing. And I hope that through my work, this conversation, people reading the 5 resets, that stress doesn't become this vague thing, and it can actually be quantified, measured, monitored, and ultimately overcome the same way you would think about as blood pressure. So I have a stress quiz in the 5 resets. And so to answer your question, I would actually say that it's all very much connected. So it depends on your symptom. So let's say you're not sleeping well. Is it stress? Is it something happening? In fact, just this morning, I had a long conversation with one of my friends who said, I'm not sleeping well and I haven't for the past few weeks. What do you think it is? Do you think it's just stress? And then my first thought was, well, you should probably go see your doctor, make sure there isn't something going on, look at your lifestyle, your habits. When are you having caffeine? What time are you going to bed? she's of a certain age. And so we talked about, whether she could get her hormones tested because we know that with menopause. So it really just depends very much on, it's a case by case basis. But stress at this moment in time that we are having this conversation, the data shows that there is an unprecedented rise in both stress and burnout. So data shows that anywhere from 50 to 70% of people are experiencing some version of stress or burnout. That's like saying in a room of 30 people, 21 people are struggling with stress or burnout. So if you are wondering, could I be stressed? Could this symptom, my doctor said everything was fine. Could this be related to stress? Again, stress doesn't cause the symptoms. It can make it worse, right? So most likely you are the rule rather than the exception, because all of us in some capacity now more than ever are experiencing stress. And so managing your stress in the now using some of the techniques that we're going to talk about today, that's in the 5 resets, etc., can actually help lots of things because it's all connected. It will help your sleep. And there's various things that we can talk about. It will help your whatever symptom you have. Ultimately, because stress makes things worse, though it might not cause the actual symptom.
All right, so the podcast is brought to you by Contact Medical Services. This service puts you in touch with a verified concussion physician specialist within 24 hours of you having your injury. This is virtually unheard of anywhere in the country, and there's good reason for it. It's because our current healthcare system doesn't allow us to get to the specialists we need to get to in a timely manner. And when you're talking about brain injury, that's particularly important. A service like this could prevent the consequences of having a concussion, such as persistent cognitive and memory issues, headaches, psychological issues. So we're proud that they're sponsoring the podcast. We'll put their website at the bottom in the YouTube description. Please check them out. And let's keep going with the episode. Yeah, that's very interesting. And you mentioned previously the stress quiz and being able to measure stress and potentially quantify it. Tell us a little bit more about that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, one of my biggest sort of pet peeves is with stress. One of the most common reasons why it's not really addressed in the exam room when you go see your doctor, and doctors are doing their utmost. They have to manage impossible standards, like absolutely impossible standards. It's simply because stress is a vague thing. It's like you're stressed, yes, no. It's not a yes, no kind of question. And then when you get that information, right? Like, what did my doctor say? She did the testing, made sure it wasn't my heart. And then she said, oh, it's probably just stress. Try to relax. And that's not very helpful. It's not concrete because what do you do to relax? You do all of the things that I did. But we can talk a little bit more about the difference between hedonic well-being and eudaimonic well-being, and why things like what I did, hedonic pleasures, don't really work they don't move the needle. They help in the short term, like you feel good, Netflix and chill, you feel great, relaxed, you eat a delicious meal, or you go, treat yourself to a massage. It feels great in the moment, but it doesn't do anything to move the needle because you're not really addressing the biology of stress in the brain and the body. So when it comes to this stress quiz that I like to give, and what I recommend in the 5 resets is that, you do this quiz, you get your score. It's a 5-question quiz. And you can actually use my website, 5resets.com, and take the quiz yourself for free. So you take the quiz, you get a score. I explain a little bit about what the score is. It's like low stress, moderate stress, high stress. And then based on that, you bring in some of the science-backed techniques that I suggest, or, things that you might be curious about. And then in 4 weeks, you check again and you see if your score has changed. And then you continue checking every 4 weeks. Understand that it takes about 8 weeks to build a habit in your brain, and falling off and getting back on is part of habit formation. It's the work that you do with neuroplasticity, but really understanding that, it takes time, but not that much time. And so I would love for stress to be seen as the way we manage and measure blood pressure. It's not this nebulous thing. It's very clear. There's a number. We manage the blood pressure. We give a number because people like numbers, right? Like I like a number when I'm managing anything. Like you need something to work with, something to hang on to. And then you can see, oh yeah, I did X, Y, and Z, and then that score changed or it went up. or it went down, etc. And then you continue every 4 weeks checking your stress score and see if it improved, or because then it will motivate you. It's like the example I give in the book. It's like, when you see a friend after you've been working out and you've been really watching what you eat and really aiming to reverse, say, metabolic syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've lost, 10 pounds or 15 pounds, but you don't notice. Your family doesn't necessarily notice because it's in your day-to-day life. But then you see a friend that you haven't seen in a couple of years, and then that friend is like, "Oh my God, you look great. Wow." And you're like, "Really? Oh, I guess so." So sometimes, because we're not the best historian of ourselves.
Yep.
And so that's also why you want to have some sort of objective metric.
I like that, and it's interesting because I think a lot of people would still feel that it's not so tangible and objective like a blood pressure, but having a number to go by, changing lifestyle, having improved sleep, working on certain aspects of yourself, and then having that number change over time, even though it is subjective report, I think can be powerful. But I wondered, is there something on the objective, in the objective sphere, that you could use to measure stress? For example, wearable devices today, technology is pretty darn good. You can wear almost any device today and get a heart rate and a heart rate variability. I know there's differences in devices and their reliability, but is there something that you know of that's out there that reliably measures stress objectively?
That's a great question. I would love to address it in this way by saying that because I am a physician and I have taken care of so many patients from various walks of life and with varying resources, everything I suggest is always cost-free.
Mm-hmm.
And it's science-backed, cost-free, and time efficient. So I very rarely, and actually never in this case, suggest things that people have to pay for, because that's really important to me. And so there are plenty of devices and technology and wearables and the quantified self movement and people doing good work in this field. But I personally haven't necessarily ever recommended it or prescribed it to my patients, simply because I am very mindful of people's varying resources. And so I believe that stress management, when you use the science, that it can actually be applicable. Anytime I suggest something, I think about how can this be applicable to the most number of people.
Yeah. So you mentioned the tiger analogy before. So clearly stress today is a lot more different than how it used to be. Not so much physical or imminent danger, more so social, right? And in today's hustle culture with advances in these technologies, these stresses are unique. Can you please tell us a little bit more about them, and maybe the things in today's society that you think are the biggest factors when it comes to this massive increased incidence in stress?
I would love to. And in fact, like I said earlier, that amygdala is within each of us, that is your stress center. We call it in science, all of the other parts of your brain have evolved as time has gone on, but your amygdala, in science, we call it the reptile brain, the reptilian brain, because quite literally it's the part of the brain that hasn't evolved the way the other parts of your brain have evolved. And so that should tell you everything you need to know about the way the amygdala responds to things. And what's really fascinating about the amygdala, among many things, is that your amygdala doesn't recognize the difference between something happening 3, 4, 5, 10,000 miles away. It feels like it's happening in your backyard. And that is all the more relevant because we are always connected to this little guy, your phone, your primary news consumption device. And one of the key reasons why we are all feeling those metaphorical tigers and that sense of chronic ongoing stress is because scrolling is a way for us to feel safe. So it's your primal urge to scroll. Evolutionarily, when we were all cave people living in tribes and sleeping at night, there would be a night watchman who would keep watch, scan for danger while the tribe slept. And now we are all our own night watchmen, and we scan for danger all day and all night long. And how do we do it? We do it through scrolling. Scrolling has become the new way to scan for danger. And the reason is it's your primal urge to scroll. When you feel unsafe, unsettled, feeling a sense of stress. Your amygdala, it's triggered. And what does your amygdala do by design? Its focus is immediate survival and self-preservation. And so when you scroll and you see a headline or you see something happening, whether it's a graphic video or a graphic image or something that is triggering to your amygdala continues to keep, the reason that you keep scrolling, it's called doom scrolling for a reason. The reason you do that is because it's your amygdala and it's trying to keep you safe. So it's actually a protective mechanism gone haywire. And so one of the most important things that you could do to really help manage your stress is to create some digital boundaries. Now, this is not about becoming a digital monk, because I'm not saying abstinence or censorship is what is required here. In fact, data shows that it's not abstinence from digital devices that helps your health and well-being. It's actually decreasing your reliance on them that does. The other thing I want to say is this is also not about censorship. I mean, my two great loves are medicine and journalism. I do so much work as a health communicator on all sorts of media outlets, and I deeply believe in the power of journalism to inform, connect, and really build and foster activism and community. And more important now than ever, I think it's really important to be an informed citizen, particularly in this era. So you want to be informed, but not at the expense of your mental health. And so one antidote to managing all of this constant onslaught of information is to create some digital boundaries. And there's several practical ways that you can do that. So the first is a geographical boundary. Keep your phone off your nightstand, invest in a low-cost alarm clock instead. Data shows that 90% of people within minutes of waking, before their second eye is even open, are scrolling headlines, scrolling their email, checking Slack channels. These are not benign entities. There's no such thing as mindless scrolling. It has a direct influence on your brain, the neurotransmitters, your cortisol, your fight or flight response, and it primes your brain for stress during the day. This is, again, you don't have to renounce technology. Just keep your phone off your nightstand and wake up, say good morning to your bed partner, say good morning to your kids, go to the bathroom, brush your teeth, and then check your phone. Give your brain a few minutes to just adjust to the light of day, to this cadence of the morning, reflect on the sleep that you got. And so that's one way to do that. It will also decrease your nighttime scrolling because it won't be on your nightstand. You can do something else instead, like read a book, listening to relaxing music, do some stretching, things that we know based on the science have really helped. One of the most common reasons when you ask people, like, why are you not going to bed that time that you want? Most people go to bed 2 hours after their after their time that they really want to. So if you want to go to bed at 10, but you're going to bed at midnight, chances are you're on a screen. And that phenomenon is called revenge bedtime procrastination, especially for working parents like me and perhaps you guys as well.
A little bit. That's one of the coolest terms I've heard when it comes to science and resilience. What does that mean?
Revenge bedtime procrastination. So if your time is not your own during the day, like most of us, when is the moment that you get to yourself, like me time? Revenge bedtime procrastination is a manifestation of hustle culture. So what are you doing? You're working all day, you're not taking any breaks, and then finally, like 8, 9 o'clock, maybe dinner is done, kids are asleep. You have that moment. You sit on your couch. That moment. It's like 9 p.m. You sit down. You're
the
like,
moment we all wait for all day, right?
All day.
Golden hour. Yeah.
And you sit. And you're like, just my time. I'm gonna go to bed early tonight. And then you start scrolling, and before you know it, it's 12:30, and you're like, wait, what did I just do? What's happening? It was just like a vortex. It's revenge bedtime procrastination. And what that is your time is not your own. And you have this, your brain needs a break. It needs to decompress. And if it's not decompressing during the day, then it's going to decompress at night. And so you start scrolling that amygdala because you're already so stressed from the day. It's triggered. You get into this stress scroll cycle. And it's like a, rebellious teenager. Your brain's like, I am going to stay up, even against your better judgment. I mean, we know lots of data to show that sleep really is so important when you're feeling a sense of stress, right? Like it's therapeutic for your brain. And yet so many of us are not getting the sleep we need or deserve simply because we're scrolling. It's not like we're doing anything important between the hours of 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. at all. Most likely, you're decompressing in front of a screen of some kind. And so instead, what you could do in that moment when you're about to engage in revenge bedtime procrastination is set your phone to grayscale. The grayscale simply means that you are removing the color from your display and switching to black and white. And you can do this in your phone by going to settings, accessibility, display, color filters, and then going to grayscale. And if you get really savvy at it, you can actually, like I can show you here, I have a phone with a color display, and I've been able to make it go black and white and then back to color.
Wow.
And I use grayscale all the time. And grayscale has shown demonstrated benefit to decrease your screen time because it, the colors is what keeps you scrolling, right? Like, so if you remove the colors, yes, you'll scroll for a bit, but then you'll kind of lose interest because
Just
it
when
makes.
you think the brain is so complex, you do something simple like that and prove that we're all susceptible to these small tweaks, these resets.
Yeah.
I wanted to just jump to a couple more unique stressors. Popcorn brain is something I've heard you say. I want to know about that and multitasking from your point of view.
Yeah, so popcorn brain is very much connected to digital boundaries and the stress that you feel and doom scrolling and how your amygdala has this primal urge to scroll. You are more at risk for popcorn brain when you are feeling stressed. And what is popcorn brain? It's a term coined by a psychologist named David Levy, and it is essentially a phenomenon that is ubiquitous. We all are at risk for popcorn brain, and chances are we all feel popcorn brain, especially now. Popcorn brain means that your brain feels like it's popping through the overstimulation of spending too much time online and living offline when you are, engaging in the day. It's slow and it moves at a different pace, and you can't really stay offline for that long. Now, popcorn brain is very different than internet addiction. That's like a common question. Does it mean I'm addicted to the internet if I have popcorn brain? No. Internet addiction is a classified diagnosis. It's a DSM-5 criteria. Internet addiction, one of the hallmarks of internet addiction is that your internet use interferes with your everyday life, your functioning, your relationships, your work, etc. That's not most people. Most people can hold down a job and hold down good relationships, and they don't have an internet addiction classified like clinically, a clinical diagnosis of that. However, what most people do have, while internet addiction is exceedingly rare, what most people do have is popcorn brain. It's everywhere. When you're at the grocery store, when you're at the bank. For many people, when you're at a traffic light, if you're a pedestrian, you're looking down at your phone. People at traffic lights, driving, looking down at their phone. You see it everywhere all the time. And so it's this need, this constant popcorning of information, and it's being overstimulated. And of course, you are at increased risk of popcorn brain because you're feeling a sense of stress. So you're scrolling, you're scanning for danger, and then that can lead to popcorn brain. So that's, why you want to create digital boundaries to decrease your risk of popcorn brain.
So you mentioned that if popcorn brain is a sensation, like your brain is popping when you're scrolling. Can you maybe detail what that feeling and that sensation is like, or is that just really difficult to do?
No, I mean, I can ask you that question, and sure, I can detail it myself. Like, I know what it feels like when I'm going from, one article to the other, to the other, to the other, that I'm scrolling. I see one 30-second video, and then I go to another 45-second video. Then it's a minute video, then 20-second video. Like the popcorning. It's what life online feels like, especially when you're scrolling through social media. It's just one hit, another hit, another hit, another hit. And these are not benign things that are happening to you, to your brain, rather. We say it's like mindless scrolling. I'm just like scrolling. I'm not doing anything. Yeah. Of course, you're doing something. It might look passive, like you're just sitting on your couch and just scrolling, like this action is what you're doing. When in fact, something very different is happening in your brain.
Yeah, that sounds like just multitasking, though. Isn't multitasking a good thing?
Multitasking. So multitasking is...
That was sarcastic, by the way.
Multitasking is what multitasking is, and this is totally different than popcorn brain. Multitasking is actually a myth. There's no such thing. Multitasking, what you are actually doing is task switching, so doing two separate tasks in rapid succession, and your brain is really wired to do one thing at a time. Multitasking doesn't really exist in the science. Like, we talk about it as a badge of honor, but quite quite literally, even though 100% of us think that we are excellent multitaskers, only 2% of human brains can truly multitask.
Mm-hmm.
And multitasking does lots of bad things. In fact, it decreases, it weakens your cognition, your memory, your attention. It ironically makes you less productive. And funnily enough, it decreases your ability to solve complex problems. So, all of the things that we talked about earlier, your prefrontal cortex, it decreases the functionality of your prefrontal cortex. And so, the antidote to multitasking is monotasking, doing one thing at a time.
Mm-hmm.
When I suggest monotasking, like the reactions I usually get is like furrowed brows, eye rolls, arms crossed, like get out of here. Monotasking one thing at a time, like not in my life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it feels like how can you monotask and the competing demands of work and life in the modern age? You can train your brain to monotask. And the way you do that is something called time blocking. So I have the workflow in the 5 resets that you could use. I think I have several samples of workflows, but it's like if you have 4 tasks to complete in the next hour, instead of doing them all at once, which we know is biologically impossible because your brain could only do one thing at a time, instead focus on one task for a few minutes, say 10 to 15 minutes, and take a short break, and do the same for tasks 2, 3, and 4, giving yourself a break. Those brain breaks that you take during the day are so, so important because studies have shown that these short brain breaks, anywhere from 2 minutes to 5 minutes throughout the day, several times a day, and in one study, as little as 10 seconds, can make a demonstrated difference in your cumulative stress at the end of the day, which, by the way, connecting it back to what we talked about earlier, will likely make you doom scroll less, will likely make you have less revenge bedtime procrastination because you're not saving up that me time for the end of the day. You'll probably go to bed earlier. You'll get deeper sleep, more therapeutic sleep. You'll wake up. It's all connected, guys.
So I think we should turn to resiliency at this point. We talked about stress already. Now let's turn to resiliency. So you mentioned before good and bad resiliency. And you mentioned the differences between them, but I'd really like to get into the weeds with it a little bit in regards to what is good resiliency and what is bad resiliency. Can you do that for us?
Sure. I wouldn't say good or bad resilience. I would say more, true resilience and toxic resilience. Mm-hmm. True resilience, I explained what it was, and true resilience honors your boundaries. It really respects your human limitations for rest and recovery, like I talked about, those breaks that are so important. It celebrates your ability to say no, whereas toxic resilience is very much what we talked about already, right? Like a mind over matter mindset. It is all systems go all the time, productivity at all costs. And so I think in many ways, we've talked a lot about resilience earlier and this idea of toxic resilience and how the goal is really to move away from toxic resilience and back to true resilience. So the other example that I could give, the reason that, when you're thinking about stress and resilience and healthy stress and good, true resilience, there's actually quite a relationship there. So healthy stress, you need a little bit of stress, healthy stress, for resilience to really show itself. Without stress, the good kind of stress, there can be no true resilience. So think about when you first learned to swim. Your instructor, the swim instructor, was that healthy stress that, kept you afloat, kept you going. Your arms are flailing and your head is above water. And that's true resilience. And with time and practice, you glide through the water with ease. But that initial gentle prodding, the initial discomfort that you might have felt, that is the relationship between healthy stress and true resilience. Now contrast that with some of the examples that you and I are very familiar with as working people here in the US. It's like, yeah, you can take on another deadline. You're resilient. Or, parent like you don't have a job and work like you don't have a family, right? Like we hear that sort of messaging all the time. Or you can take on more work. You're resilient. You don't need help taking care of your kids. You're resilient. So these sorts of messages that we've gotten, we think they're true resilience, but in fact, it is toxic resilience. So it's no wonder that you're going to say to yourself, I must not be that resilient. because I'm feeling all of these things and I feel like I might be stressed or burnt out. I probably am not that resilient. And that is a great myth. And it's the great resilience myth. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from our conversation today, it's that. It's that I'm here to debunk that resilience myth, because resilient people can and do get burned out. Just look at the data. 70% of people right now are feeling a sense of either stress or burnout now more than ever. And in fact, one study in the UK put that number up to 90% over the last month. So I mean, it is
Wow.
everywhere.
Yeah, it's interesting that the that resiliency culture is that message is coming from the top, right? From the people that are the
That's right.
bosses or the executives. It's very interesting that that's who's kind of delivering that message to us.
And it really changed. I think if we had had this conversation like in 2018, I think that when I thought very long and hard about putting that word on the cover of my book. So the title of my book is The Five Resets, but the full title is The Five Resets: Rewire Your Brain and Body for Less Stress and More Resilience. And wow, did I agonize over that word resilience. I was like, do it, because it's cringy to me. It's so cringeworthy. I mean, I have a visceral response when I hear that word resilience, or when someone tells me to be more resilient, or I don't know. That word is like, don't tell me to be more resilient. And a lot of that, stems from this idea of toxic resilience, which has truly just taken off. I think if we had had this conversation in 2018, perhaps even 2019, resilience would have still had a positive connotation, right? It's like, it was a fine word. It was positive. It's a good word. But something changed and shifted during the pandemic. I don't want to use the P word too often. But something changed. Something changed in the pandemic, and that word and the definition of what it means, it morphed into something dark and sinister. And now you hear the word resilience and you're like, please. Because it was a real buzzword in 2020, 2021. And it's like, I don't want to hear that word anymore. Right. So I thought very much about, like, do I include this as a subtitle on my book? But I deeply believe that we can all learn to step into our true resilience and debunk this idea of toxic resilience. So ultimately I leaned in and I said, yeah, I want to do it.
I was just going to say, it sounds like, and from the next bit of conversation we have before we tie everything up, resilience can be learned. And rewiring the brain suggests, as it's in your book title and the five resets, suggests that anybody can take these exercises or similar ones and build true resilience. And so I'd like to take the next bit of time and go over the five resets in your words. I want to see what you have to say to us, and how you can communicate that to your audience, if you could, starting with one: get clear on what matters most. Can you go through that one with us?
Sure. So the first reset is get clear on what matters most. And it simply is a way to get out of amygdala mode back to the prefrontal cortex. And there are several strategies. So the five resets overall are five small but mighty mindset shifts that really can transform your relationship to stress. And in the five resets, the book, there are about 15 science-backed strategies, like I said, all cost-free, all actionable and practical, that you can use today. Because that was also very important to me, that I don't, when you're feeling a sense of stress, I don't want you to feel more stressed by using some of these resets and building them into your life. So they have to feel easy, accessible. And of course, they have to be effective, because, there's so much information out there that is frankly not scientifically based. And so staying close to the science was and is very important to me. And so that first reset is about how to get out of that amygdala mode back to the prefrontal cortex. It's so easy when you're feeling a sense of stress to get in your own way. It's not you, it's how your brain is designed. It's the amygdala. You're thinking about the immediate when you're feeling a sense of stress, because that's your amygdala, immediate survival and needs. And so this particular reset has 3 strategies in it that helps you without really even doing much. You just follow the plan, gets you out of that immediate needs mode, and helps you create a plan.
Yeah, I think that plan helps you set boundaries too when you start prioritizing your core values. To be able to, if you're spending time with family and that's important to you and you've prioritized that, then that's it. You're not bringing any work into that domain. You're just keeping it as is. So I think that's great. But on to the second one, finding quiet in a noisy world, create moments of silence and calm in your daily routine?
So, this one we've talked about during our conversation. It's about creating digital boundaries, it's about protecting your sleep and the stress sleep cycle we talked about, and the stress scroll cycle. And so, this second reset actually helps you operationalize a lot of what we talked about earlier: how to overcome revenge bedtime procrastination, why you have that primal urge to scroll, and what you can do about it. And then finally, getting clear rather um, getting clear on those digital boundaries and how to actually implement those boundaries in your everyday life.
The next one, sync your brain and your body. Just to say one word about it before I let you go on, it is we're going to have Dr. Bessel van der Kolk on Body Keeps the Score of trauma. And so thinking about how the body is involved in stress and resilience is huge, and it's harder, I think, and for people to conceptualize and less looked at. But the body and the manifestations of stress that you talked about are as involved as the brain and the mind. And so maybe you could just tell us why you put body in there, and tell us a little bit more about sync your brain and your body.
Yeah. So that particular reset is all about the mind body connection. And it's what I have spent a lot of my training learning about and doing research on. The mind body connection is nothing more than the basic idea that your brain and body are inextricably linked and in constant communication. What's good for your body is good for your brain, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. And when you do better, you feel better. So you have all experienced moments of your mind body connection: palms, sweaty palms right before a meeting, your heart racing before an important event, or before you're getting on stage, or a presentation, butterflies of falling in love. All of these are examples of the mind body connection. Mm-hmm. This particular reset is about the mind-body connection, first becoming aware of it, but then learning strategies to actually harness it and tap into it to manage your stress. And Stop, Breathe, Be is actually one of those strategies that is in this particular reset.
Yeah, that's incredible. We did we're doing a little microbiome and gut health series. And
cool.
One thing that with some of the folks over at Zoe, the big microbiome company, but a point that was kind of underlying our entire conversation that we were having was the sense of intuitive eating, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm getting the same sense from our conversation today is, just being intuitive about your own body, what you're feeling and why you're feeling it, as a first step to changing your circumstances. And if those feelings are negative, then altering those sensations and those feelings. What do you think about this sort of intuitive sense of understanding what's going on in your own body?
So I don't actually know much about intuitive eating as a field. It is a very broad field, and I don't know much about it, but I do write quite a bit about the gut-brain connection in the 5 resets, which is a known entity. And research in the gut-brain connection, it's an emerging field and growing every day. Mm-hmm. Simply, the gut-brain connection is another version of the mind-body connection, and the gut is your second brain. It has more serotonin receptors, and serotonin, we know, is very much a brain chemical, right? So, SSRIs, for example, the class of drugs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, things like Prozac. So serotonin, there are more serotonin receptors, 3 to 5 times more serotonin receptors in your gut than your brain. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, your gut is your second brain, because the microbiome, it's a ecosystem of trillions of bacteria. And what the microbiome does, it doesn't just do digestion. It can regulate all sorts of things: glucose control, circadian rhythm, and, as it turns out, even your mood, your stress, your resilience. In the microbiome, there's a subset called the psychobiome, which is healthy bacteria in your gut whose sole role is managing stress, burnout, mood regulation, resilience, etc. So incredible. This is a fascinating field.
Yeah. And you've talked about it before, and I want to make sure we hit it, is movement. So not necessarily, exercising for, for a certain look, but rather movement for stress reduction.
When I think about exercise and movement, I'm so happy you used that term movement. It's more about the promise of mental fitness and physical fitness,
Hmm.
because when you are engaging in a habit, when you do a little bit every day, you avoid decision fatigue rather than doing something once in a while. And I could talk endlessly about the benefits of movement. And again, it taps into that mind body connection. What's good for your body is good for your brain, and vice versa. And movement has been shown to be very important for certain parts of the brain, for managing stress, and for other parts of the brain. It's really, really important.
But you've said before, because I've heard you on a previous podcast, it's not necessarily the movement, it's just not sitting, because sitting, the negative effects of sitting are so significant and robust. What do you
That's
think?
right. That's right. I have said that. And there's a lot of data, and I write about it in the five resets as well, that it's not just that sitting, it's not just that exercise is good for you, that movement is good for you, but in fact, sitting is bad for you. It has been shown when you have prolonged sitting. I don't mean sitting like how you and I are sitting and talking, but we are sedentary and sitting for hours a day, particularly now more than ever. And so it has it has pretty big implications on all sorts of things, particularly our mental health.
Mm.
And so data has shown that when you sit for prolonged periods of time, it actually can help. It can actually um, cause more anxiety. So there's a
Mm.
real link between mental health and physical health in this way.
Mm.
Uh, so number 4 we have, which kind of gets at this a little bit: come up for air, take breaks.
So this next reset, come up for air, it's not actually about air and breathing. I talk about that in another reset. This particular one is about creating mental bandwidth. And so we talked about this earlier, multitasking and the myth of multitasking, and going forward instead, the antidote to that of monotasking.
And 5,
And five.
Bring your
bring
best
your
self
best self
forward.
forward. Yeah, let's hear about
Bring
that.
your best self forward is, really leaning into this idea of silencing your inner critic.
Mm.
With your inner critic, that amygdala has a megaphone, and your inner critic is yet another protective mechanism gone haywire. And it's about strategies to help silence that inner critic so that you can live your best life and really, move forward to be the best version that you can be, with less stress and more resilience.
That's a fantastic way to end it, I think. Dr. Aditi, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you,
Um,
guys.
you
Such a
know,
pleasure to join you.
yeah, well, I'm sure a lot of people are going to get so much out of this. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you for everything that you do. It's really an honor having you on. Any final words?
No, we really appreciate it. Maybe you could just tell everyone where they can find you and your book.
Yes, you can find me on all social media channels at Dr. Aditi Neurukar. That's at DrAditiNerurkar. You can also check out my website, 5resets, number 5resets.com, to do your own free personalized stress quiz. And my book, The Five Resets, is available in 35 countries and 15 languages. And the paperback edition is now out January 2025. So get your copy. It's also available in Kindle, hardback, and audiobook narrated by me.
Incredible. Thank you so much. I took the stress score while we were doing the episode. I scored a 9. Hopefully, next time we have you back, that score will be a little bit different after I employ some of these resets. Okay. Thank you so
That's
much.
amazing. That's amazing.